This video is brought to you by FishHuntShoot.com. For more and bigger trout, go to FishHuntShoot.com. Howdy guys, Kel Kellogg here. Now what you're watching me reel in a very nice Lake Shasta rainbow. I caught this fish a couple years ago now. It was about 4 pounds, and let me give you a little background. I caught the fish on a grub. The deal was, the fish were down deep. The fish was about 100 feet deep when it struck. We'd been marking a lot of fish, but they had totally rejected spoons and flies. We tried spoons and flies for probably 90 minutes or so with very little action, a few bumps, and that was it. We knew the fish were feeding on shad. We knew it was a tough bite. Clearly the fish were full of food, and we needed to present something to them that we could fish slow, that we could, fish subtly, but something that looked, acted, and felt like a natural shad. So I immediately reached for my plastic grubs. And more specifically, I reached for a plastic grub that looked a lot like a shad. In this case, it was a firecracker grub, a 3-inch grub. And because I wanted to be subtle, I grabbed a set of Max Lure Mylar flashers. I took off one blade, dropped that down to the level of the fish, and lo and behold, we started hooking up. I believe we got 4 fish that day. The 4-pounder was the biggest. All the others were over 3. So hey, we had 4 trout at Lake Shasta during a difficult midsummer bite, and all of those fish were over 3 pounds. We had 12 plus pounds of fish for a morning fishing session. Not bad for a difficult day out on Lake Shasta. Now, from the title of this video, you know what we're going to be talking about, but let me review a little bit. We are going to be talking about the trout trolling pyramid. We are still down here on the lower level, the cornerstone lures. Last time we talked about flies. The time before that we talked about spoons. Today we are talking about soft baits, and that encompasses a very broad range of baits and lures and presentation. Now, when I say soft baits, I'm referring to everything from, tubes like that, curly tail plastic grubs, large hoochies like my frenzy squid, as well as things like, gulp crawlers, gulp minnows, and of course, my all-time favorite freshwater natural bait, night crawlers in a can. Now, because it's a very hot day here in Northern California, I'm going to let my worms stay in the refrigerator because I don't want to shock them with the heat. But we'll be talking about some night crawler rigging as well. Now, when we're talking about these soft baits, the baits and the rigging of the baits and what you use the baits for, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is what you pair the baits with. Do you pair them with dodgers? Do you pair them with flashers? Do you pair them with micro flashers? Do you pair them with spinners? Or do you fish them naked? And the answer to that question is yes. Absolutely yes, because they are among the most versatile baits that you can use. They're versatile in terms of speed, presentation, color, shape, size, but they all have one thing in common. They're soft, they feel natural, they taste natural to the fish, and fish tend to hit them, and they tend to hang on, and they tend to respond to these baits very well when they're in a neutral or turned off mood. In other words, soft baits are the baits that I often turn to when the going gets tough. In reality, there is so many, I should say, options in the world of soft baits that you could fish these baits season after season after season and catch all the trout you want to catch and never exhaust the full array of options that are available to you in the soft bait world. And we should start off by kind of blowing out of the water some of the assumptions about soft baits. Let me grab a grub here. I've got all kinds of tackle arrayed below me here. Let's take a soft plastic grub here. Now this is probably my favorite soft bait, my favorite non-worm soft bait. It's a curly tail grub. Now, most guys will tell you a grub like this, it needs to be fished slowly. Well, that's simply not true. My favorite speed range for a grub like this is anywhere from, say, 1.5 to 2 miles an hour. You could troll them much slower than that. You could troll them down to, sub 1 mile an hour, but you can also bump the speed up to 3 miles an hour. And, when you look at rigging of these, you can rig them on a lead head. You can rig them on a straight shank hook. You can rig them on a modified straight shank hook. You can rig them on a slow death hook, and every one of those riggings is going to result in a different type of action. Maybe, one day they want this grub rigged on the slow death hook. They want it rotating through the water. On another day, they want it rigged on a modified straight shank hook so it moves back and forth through the water, much like a Zara spook does when a black bass guy or a striper guy is walking the dog on the surface. So the number of options and tweaks and modifications that you can do when you're fishing soft baits is almost endless. But again, at its core, a soft bait, whether we're talking about a night crawler or a grub or a gulp bait or whatever, it's a bait that the fish tend to grab and hang on to because it tastes real, it feels real, it encourages neutral fish or turned off fish to grab that bait and then gulp it down and get that hook. Get that hook in the mouth, we have a hookup, we're happy campers. So let's kick off the discussion with a discussion of soft plastic grubs. So I'm holding up one of my grub kits here. I'll get that kind of close to the camera. This one's not completely full because I've been using it out on the FHS boat. But what you find in my grub kit is really typical of the grubs you'll find out on the market. And I would love you to fish my grubs. I think I offer the best selection of grubs, when you consider price and versatility that you're going to find anywhere. But by all means, you can go to the store, get some grubs, and employ the techniques that I'm going to throw out at you. So, it's important to have grubs in some different sizes. Typically, I'm fishing 3-inch grubs, my number 1 choice, and 2-inch grubs, that's my number 2 choice. And here's something to think about when you're fishing grubs and when you're thinking about grub size. I'm going to hold up a 2-inch grub by the camera here. In fact, with my big fingers, it's kind of hard to see, but let me hold this up here. So on a 2-inch grub, the body is really only about 1 inch long, and then you have the tail, that accounts for some of the length, but the tail, the fish just see that as movement, it's tail action. So even though this is a 2-inch grub, when the fish look at it, it really looks like a very small bait fish or an insect larva because it's really, the body part is only about 1 inch long. Now, when you look at a larger grub, let me grab one of these olive colored 3-inchers here. The same thing is true. The body of a 2-inch grub is only, a 3-inch grub. Body of a 3-inch grub is less than 2 inches long, and it has a fairly long tail. But the fish, the trout, they don't see that as the total length of the bait. What they see is a 2-inch prey item. They either mistake it for a shad or a pond smelt or a baby crawfish or some sort of insect larva like a dragonfly nymph or something like that. Or maybe they just get the impression of something that's kind of struggling through the water that looks good to eat, that feels good in their mouth, and fish on. But the bottom line is, even though it's a 3-inch grub, it's only really, in the eyes of the fish, about 2 inches long. And when we're thinking about rainbow trout, 2 to 2.25 inches, that is a key length for me. That's the length of my trigger spoons. That's the length of a lot of my flies. That is a prey size that appeals to both pan-sized fish and large fish. It's big enough to interest a large fish, but it's not so big as to put a small fish off. So, 2.25 inch baits, very versatile. They're kind of right in the mainstream of the size of the baits that I use because they're not intimidating to small fish, but again, they're big enough to get the interest of large fish. So, day in, day out, I like to rig my grubs on a slow death hook. Let me grab one and I'll show you the basic rigging. So here is a smoke colored, kind of smoke and flake colored grub. It is pinned on a slow death hook, and to that hook I've got about 40 inches of 8-pound test fluorocarbon leader material. Now, this one I just took off the leader holder so it doesn't have a loop in it. If I was going to fish this right now, I would put a loop in the top end of that leader. I would hook it on the trolling swivel of my rod. That's very important because grubs will tangle your line. You might even want to use a rudder with a grub because that is going to spin through the water. The combination of the tail and that slow death hook, it's going to rotate and roll and it will twist your line. But I would tie a loop in there. I would attach it to the end of my line. I would start trolling somewhere between 1.5 and 2.2 miles an hour. I would put it just above the depth that I believe the fish to be holding at, and that's all I would do. Simple as that. Now, when you start to modify grubs and you start to look for different types of action, you want to start out by messing around with the hook that you're using. My first choice is that slow death hook, and I think most of you guys are familiar with that, but if you're not, that's a slow death hook. It's a walleye hook, and you can see those bends in the shank. Well, those bends in the shank, they'll make a worm or a leech, or in this case, a soft plastic grub, rotate through the water. That's very attractive to trout and other game fish. But let's look at some other riggings, starting off with some different types of hooks. Okay, I'm back. Now pay attention because I'm about to give you guys a secret about fishing grubs and rigging grubs. But before I get into that, I've got a 3-inch pink colored grub right there. And I have a number 4 straight shank ring-eyed bronze hook. Now you could put that hook on a leader, tie it on with a Palomar knot, take your grub. This is important, anytime you're rigging a grub. Figure out which way the tail of that grub wants to curl. See how it curls that way? That means you want the hook point on the opposite side. So go ahead, take your grub, take your hook, insert your hook point into the grub like this, work the grub down the hook, down, down, down it goes, pop it out right just before the tail, like so. Slide that grub up onto the hook, pop the eye of the hook inside the grub, and you have a nice straight rigged grub. Now that grub, due to the tail, is still going to roll through the water column, and that's fine. It's not going to roll as vigorously as it would on a slow death hook, but it will still roll. But if you want to start playing with the action of the grub, and this is something you need to do aside of your boat, and if you really want to get into this kind of fishing, I would tell you to take a half an hour and just play with different hooks and different ways of rigging the hooks and keep putting those grubs in the water, and you're going to find out that you can alter the action of the grubs significantly. Got here a handy needle nose pliers. I'm going to take that hook, I'm going to grab it right here, grab the first third of the hook right there like that, and I'm going to give that hook a bend, just like that. See that? Now, what you're going to see here on the screen is you're going to see a grub moving through the water kind of in a walk the dog, side to side motion, okay? Game fish find that motion very, very attractive. And the grub you saw there on the screen, that grub was rigged on a European carp hook, but you can do the same thing by taking a straight shank ring-eyed hook like that and putting a little bend in it. You gotta monkey around with the amount of bend, but go ahead, take your grub, put that hook into the grub, work that grub down just the same way, work it down, pop the hook out just before the tail, just like we did before, and what you end up with is a grub that has a little bit of a turned up nose. It's very subtle. But when you pull that through the water, when you mess with it a little bit, mess with the speed, mess with the bend, mess around with the rigging, it does take a little bit of time to refine it, you're going to end up with a grub that walks through the water like that, or you might come up with your own grub motion that's very effective in some situations. My point is that grubs are a bait that you can experiment with a great deal, and we haven't even got into flashers and blades yet. We're still just playing with the grubs and the different kinds of hooks. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you've also seen my swarm rig. My swarm rig consists of 3 3-inch grubs and a small dodger. Well, I'm using that to simulate a school of threadfin shad. So extremely versatile. That's why I rate soft plastic grubs as the #1 soft bait in my arsenal. They're right up there with the night crawler. You know, I'm going to give the edge to the night crawler, but I'm an old school bait guy. But they're right there neck and neck with the night crawler just because they're so versatile. You could fish them down in the foothill type reservoirs, valley reservoirs that are bait fish reservoirs. You could fish them up in the high country where the fish feed on bugs, or maybe a combination of bugs, tui chubs, and crawfish, stuff like that. Across the spectrum, the grub, due to the sizes, the feel, the color, the variations you can impart with different types of hooks and different types of speeds, it's just an all-around trout bait. They will catch fish high, low, in between, the world over. It's just a phenomenal bait that should be in your tackle box, and you should spend some time learning how to fish them to the maximum advantage. Now, I'm going to talk about dodgers and flashers at the end of this video, and it's going to be a long video, but we'll talk about that at the end of this video, and we'll kind of cover it globally. All of our soft baits will be covered in that dodger flasher kind of section. So anyway, that's the story with grubs. Let's move on to tubes, because tubes, they're extremely versatile too, and they're kind of the opposite of grubs. If you think of grubs as having a lot of action, a lot of flash, a lot of roll through the water, well, tubes, they're a different story. They're very subtle, but they're a very good bait fish imitation. All right, let's talk tubes. What you're watching right now is you're watching a fish being caught on one of my minnow tubes, and that minnow tube isn't paired with a wiggle disc or a dodger or a flasher. It's just a straight, naked tube. Most guys don't do that with tubes, but a tube is a great finesse, do-nothing minnow imitation. Now, when I talk about tubes, I'm talking about everything from my minnow tubes or my shad tubes, just like that, to my minnow tubes, to hoochies. It could be a small hoochie, it could be a large hoochie, it could be a 2.5-inch hoochie, like that frenzy squid right there. Or it could be, you know, a minnow profile bait like a gulp minnow. It could be a drop shot bait, just a minnow profile bait that has very little action. You know, these baits here, and a hoochie and a tube, if you put them on a hook, drag them through the water, they have very little action, and very few guys do that with hoochies and tubes or the profile baits like the gulp minnows. But you should do it more often. It should be done more often than it is, because sometimes that do-nothing presentation will absolutely slay the fish when they don't want a more active lure, when they don't want a fly teamed with an action disc, or they don't want, you know, a spoon or a plug or something like that. Sometimes less is more, and sometimes just a minnow tube or a shad tube on a leader, you know, sporting a number 6 treble hook, will get the job done when nothing else will. Now, having said that, that's not the standard way to rig a tube or one of the do-nothing profile baits. The standard way to rig those is to rig them behind a dodger, 2.5 dodger links behind a blade. The blade imparts the action on the tube, and you know, the blade draws in the fish. They expect to see a fish feeding. They're seeing that flash, they're feeling that vibration. They come in and they see a little minnow darting, you know, behind what they take to be a feeding fish. They grab it, fish on. So that's definitely your standard rigging, your most popular rigging, but I think far too many guys don't go beyond that. They don't rig them naked, and another great option is taking a tube and teaming it with an action disc just like that. Now, here's a very standard minnow tube. This could be a hoochie, whatever, but this is something that a lot of guys will run at lakes like Shasta, Folsom, Oroville, places where there's, you know, king salmon or a mix of king salmon and rainbows. They'll take a tube like that and they'll run it behind a 6-inch blade. Well, that's fantastic, but what I like to do, I like to put a leader through there, put a number 6 treble on it, and then take an action disc like that and put that on the leader, and I'll take that action disc and I will just shove it right into the tube. just like that. And guess what? Now you've created a minnow tube that has a very erratic swimming action. It's almost like a very compact trolling fly, and you get maximum movement out of that tail. And if you pin a piece of anchovy skin on it, man, that's the total package. You don't need to rig it with a blade. Sometimes that will outfish the same exact minnow tube rigged behind a 6-inch blade. You just don't know. But again, as with all soft plastics, these things are ripe for experimentation. Experiment, 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 and you're going to get maximum results, and you're going to start to gain, experience out on the water with that experimentation, and you're going to have, a range of different presentations you can pull out of your hat when the going gets tough, or maybe even when the going doesn't get tough. I know plenty of guys that their number one choice when they hit the lake is either a grub or a tube. That's what they rely on day in, day out to catch their fish. So let's move on. Let's move on to worm profile baits and night crawlers. Okay, let's talk worms and worm-shaped baits like these gulp crawlers right here. And I'm going to kind of let the cat out of the bag. Very shortly, in the very near future, I am going to unveil my own brand, my own type of soft plastic worms, but we'll talk more about that later. And like I said, I'm not bringing my night crawlers out here. I don't want them to suffer in this heat. So we're going to be playing with gulp worms, but everything I say about the gulp worm is applicable to soft plastic worms as well as natural night crawlers. And if you're looking for night crawler tutorials, there's a bunch of them on the channel here. I'm very passionate about fishing worms for trout, and you will find a ton of information about rolling night crawlers. Now, gulp baits, these baits are biodegradable. They're made out of soybeans, and they have that awesome gulp scent and taste on them. It's a water soluble scent, and the fish love it. They love the taste of it. They will grab these, they will gulp them down. I don't think they like them quite as much as they like a natural worm, but it is a very close neck and neck race. And my fishing partner, my guiding partner, Wes, he actually prefers the gulp. He has more confidence when he has gulp on his line than he does when he has a night crawler on the line. And confidence means a lot. So I've taken one of these gulp baits out of the package right here. It looks like a natural crawler. One end is hollow, the other end isn't hollow. If I was using a natural night crawler, I'd be using a worm threader. Again, if you want to know how to do that, look here on the channel, and you will find plenty of information about threading worms. But I'm going to take that worm right there, that gulp crawler. I'm going to take my slow death hook. This is a #1 slow death hook attached to some 8-pound test fluorocarbon leader material. I'm going to take the point of that hook, I'm going to put it in the hollow end of that gulp worm, and I'm just going to start working the worm right down the shank of the hook, just like that. And when I'm almost to the end, I'm going to pop the hook point out, just like that. And then I'm going to work that worm around until he's all the way on the hook. And what I have is a night crawler, or in this case a gulp crawler, that is going to roll through the water perfectly because of the bends in that slow death hook. And most of the time, you want your worm rotating through the water. Now, once you have the worm on the hook, you got a lot of options. You can fish it naked with no blades, no flashers. You could fish it very close to a dodger or a flasher, or you could fish it a good distance away from a dodger or a flasher. Very often I will use a small dodger or a turbo flasher with a worm, but I'll space it out 36 to 40 inches. That has been a deadly big fish technique for us for the past 2 years. There's just enough flash and vibration being put out by the blade or the turbo to draw fish into the area. They see that rolling night crawler, done deal, fish on. And that approach works with natural night crawlers, with gulp crawlers, and with, soft plastic worm imitations as well. So this is just, it's simple, it's not sexy, it's absolutely deadly. And if you've been watching the channel any length of time, you've seen me catch many large fish on this sort of rig right here. So let's kind of wrap this up by talking about spinners, flashers, dodgers, and how you can team those with soft plastics, with grubs, with tubes, minnow tubes, and with natural bait. So I'll grab some attractors, some dodgers and stuff, and I'll be right back. Now, one of the most common questions I've gotten about the trout trolling pyramid so far is, where do spinners fit into my approach? And my typical answer is, spinners fit into my soft bait approaches, when I'm fishing natural night crawlers, when I'm fishing grubs, when I'm fishing tubes, stuff like that. That's where my spinners fit in, and we'll kick it off with that concept right there. Now, a lot of guys, I'd say almost all of you guys, you have wedding ring type spinners in your tackle box. Those things are awesome. They're great. I have them. I use them. But I also have my own spinners, which are made with my micro turbos, just like that. This is actually one of the leaders that comes in my my micro turbo worm trolling kit, and it comes with the slow death hook attached to the leader, some beads, and one of the micros. Now, this is ready to put on a threaded worm, a gulp worm, or you could put on a, let me grab one here. You can easily take a soft plastic grub like this, pin it on the hook just like I showed you, just like we'd do if we were trolling it naked. Pop it on the hook just like that, and guess what? You've paired a grub with a turbo. Or you could pin this on the hook, trailing a wedding ring, and you've teamed a grub, the effectiveness of a grub, with the flash and vibration of a blade. Likewise, you can also take, I would probably take off the slow death hook and put a smaller hook on there. But likewise, you can grab a shad tube or a minnow tube or a hoochie, pin it on a hook behind either a micro turbo like I have here, or the type of spinner you find on a wedding ring, and have a very effective shad imitation that also offers some flash and vibration. Of course, you can vary the color a great deal by using wedding rings of different colors, or my micros of different colors, or just getting your hands on some of my micros and teaming them with different color beads. But the bottom line is, when you're using soft baits, that is a great time to play around with spinners. It's an easy way to add flash and vibration to a soft bait without using anything that's really big. Something, a lot of times, as I said earlier, when we're fishing these soft baits, when we're fishing the natural baits, we're doing it because the fish are a little bit off. They're not chasing, they're not really even feeding, and that's why we're using the finesse approach. That's why we're using the soft baits, and that is a really subtle way of adding flash and vibration to a soft bait. All right, we've talked about the subtle stuff. Let's bust out the medium and large caliber guns here. Let's talk about blades. I got a handful of blades here, and I got some flashers here in this hand. Now, let's start off with the flashers. You can use the old school metal flashers, and I have some of those in my guiding tackle box, and some days I absolutely use them. Those are a great attractor to pair any kind of soft bait with, whether we're talking about grubs, smaller grubs, worms, gulp, whatever you've got, soft baits, they team really well with those type of flashers. 50 million retired guys in 10, Sears Roebuck boats, can't be wrong. It seems like every pair of old dudes I see up in the Sierra are pulling Ford fenders on a worm, and guess what? They catch fish almost every time they go out on the water. They might not catch as many fish as I catch on any given day, but they almost always have something hanging from their stringer. And yes, they're always trailing an old school chain stringer aside of the boat with a couple nice trout on it. So enough said about those. I much prefer the turbo flashers, simply because my turbo flashers, they're not something that the fish see every day. They're very low drag, and they come in a myriad of different colors. A lot of guys like the chrome versions best, but I can absolutely tell you they both work. Got to experiment a little bit, depends on the day, the water clarity, the height of the sun, all that kind of stuff factors in. But you really can't go wrong with a turbo flasher, to pair with any of our soft baits. You can certainly rig the bait close to the turbo, but I advise getting it back there anywhere from 24 to 40 inches. Remember, the turbo is just a means of attracting fish into the area where your bait is working. Then they see the bait, then it's fish on. So turbo flashers, standard flashers, whatever, the Max Mylar flashers, they all work. But a flasher, and I tend to go on the subtle side with the flashers, but you know, you don't have to. Again, those old guys in a tin boat, they would disagree. But pairing the soft baits, natural worms, the gulp minnows, that stuff, with a flasher is an absolutely phenomenal option. Now, let's go to a blade that almost everybody has. This is my 6-inch watermelon fisheye dodger. This is the exact same blade as a 6-inch sling blade. They're marketed under many different names. This is a great blade, and it really shines for fishing a tube behind it. And you know, that's really what we consider a salmon rig here in Northern California. If we're out targeting landlocked kings, you'll see a lot of guys pulling a 6-inch slim profile dodger, just like that fisheye, and they'll have either a white hoochie or a white minnow tube about 2.5 blade lengths behind the blade, using 8, 10, 12 pound test fluorocarbon leader material. You want that that minnow tube or that hoochie back there just enough so it has a bit of a darting action as that blade kicks through the water. King salmon, rainbow trout, they think there's a fish feeding over there. They go over there. What do they see? They see the flashes and vibration. They're feeling the vibration of a fish feeding, and they see a little minnow going through that melee. They shoot up there. They grab it. The blade, you know, it triggers that predatory instinct in the fish, and the small profile minnow bait, it closes the deal. Very standard offering. It's always worth experimenting with, but you have to be aware sometimes when the fish are turned off, when the fish aren't really in a feeding mood, they might not be, you know, willing to go into close quarters with a big blade like that. Now, when the situation is like that, you might be better off going with one of the small dodgers that's on the market, whether you're going with a Sepp Sidekick or a Strike Master or one of my small willow leafs like this. This is more subtle. It will draw fish into the area, but it's not going to really scare them. And again, I don't like to crowd the bait up on the back of these blades because I'm subtle. I'm going subtle. So I like to space it out anywhere from 24 to 40 inches. 40 inches has been money for me. We've caught trout up to 12 pounds on this blade, trailing a worm 40 inches behind the blade, 1.8 miles an hour. Fish on, smiles all around, high fives. It is a great big fish presentation when the going gets tough. And the final piece of hardware I have in my hand is a trolling rudder. Not only do trolling rudders keep twist out of your line, which is fantastic, they also tend to attract fish. It's a very subtle way of adding flash and some vibration that the fish can feel through their lateral line to your rig. So the more I run trolling rudders, like that one right there, the more I like them and the more fish I catch behind them. I'm sold on them. You should give them a try. The battle against line twist is real. We talk about it here all the time on the channel, but I'm finding that at times I will catch more fish when I'm trolling, say, a naked worm or something like that, or a naked grub on a rod that's rigged with a rudder as opposed to a rod that's just rigged with the trolling swivel. So that is a very broad, very basic overview of soft baits. This is a massive subject, guys. The big three baits for me, big three baits in my arsenal are spoons, flies, and the soft stuff. I could just fish those for the rest of my life. I would catch plenty of trout. So it's a big subject. I've covered it quickly. If you're not pulling soft stuff, whether, we're talking about curly tail grubs, minnow tubes, the gulp stuff, natural crawlers, you should be. They are a critical piece of the trout fishing puzzle if your goal is to consistently catch more fish, thereby catching big fish, and that's all of our goals here on the channel. I want to catch more and bigger fish. Well, soft baits are going to allow you to do that. Soft baits are the baits that I reach for when the going gets tough. Get some, Get them in your tackle box, start playing with them, start learning the nuances of rigging and fishing them. Don't have a closed mind. If you're trolling a speedy shiner over here and you think you want to try a grub over there, by all means, pull a grub at 3 miles an hour. Pull a tube at 3 miles an hour. Take a leap of faith. Pull a tube without any added action and see what happens. The results will shock you. I've been shocked time and time again when I catch a fish on a naked tube with no attractor, no dodger, no wiggle disc being pulled through the water at 2.5 miles an hour, and it's fish on. Take the leap of faith, get some soft plastics, start playing with them, and really learn how to fish them. You're not going to regret it. I'm out of here. I'm Kel Kellogg. If you're looking for gear, you know where to go. FishHuntShoot.com. Thanks a lot, guys, and please hit that subscribe button.